Hello and welcome to another edition of RHOX Garage. I'm your host Kevin. On this episode, we're going to show you how to install an LGT-695 Deluxe wiring harness on this 2011 Club Car DS. Now before we get started, let's take a look at what's included with your wire harness, as well as all the tools necessary. We also want to show you the difference between the LGT-395 Basic Harness, as well as our LGT-695 Deluxe Harness. Now we have two different wire harness options, and here's what's included with each. Now with the Basic Harness, you'll receive the harness itself, as well as some zip ties to secure it in place. And then as far as the Deluxe Harness goes, you'll receive the Deluxe Harness, as well as some zip ties to secure it in place. Now that we've shown you what's included with your wire harness, let's take a look at the tools necessary to perform the installation. Now here are the tools that we will be using for our installation. First we have a ratchet with a 1/2-inch socket, multimeter, a trim removal tool, pair of cutters, some safety glasses, and a cordless screw gun. Now that we've gone over the tools that we'll be using, let's take a closer look at our basic wiring harness versus our deluxe wiring harness. Now before we get started with the installation, we just want to take a couple minutes to explain the differences between our LGT-395 basic harness and our LGT-695 deluxe harness. Now what we have laid out here is the LGT-395 basic harness. Now on the basic harness, the two white connectors will be for our headlights. There will be no labels for the headlights, as it does not matter which side they go to. Next down the line will be our push-pull switch, and this is what will turn our headlights and taillights on and off. Now to the middle section, you'll have your positive and negative connections for the battery. And then coming down to the end, you'll have the two red connectors. These will be for the taillights. Again, they're not labeled as to which side they go to. However, you'll have one side that is longer than the other. The longer side will route to our passenger side taillight. Now that we've taken a closer look at the LGT-395 basic harness, we're going to move on to the LGT-695 deluxe harness. Now on the LGT-695 deluxe harness, you'll notice that there are a few extra components that aren't available on the LGT-395 basic harness. Now the first difference between the deluxe harness and the basic harness is that the headlight harnesses are labeled for driver and passenger side. Now this is because if you install a turn signal, obviously you're going to want to make sure that when you place your left blinker on, your left light comes on versus turning the left blinker on and having your right light come on. Now you have the two 3-pin headlight connectors themselves. These wires here are going to be for your high-low switch. And then these are auxiliary wires that you can hook up a side mirror to with turn signal. You can run your wires directly to these connectors here. Now as we work our way further down the harness, you'll find the same push-pull switch that's on the basic harness that will operate your headlights and taillights. You will also find 12-volt positive and negative terminals for installing a power outlet. And then working our way a little bit further down, you'll have this 9-pin connector, which is where you will plug a turn signal in if you are using it. You'll also have this bullet connector here, which will plug into your turn signal for the high-low activation. If you're not using a turn signal, you want to install the included 9-pin jumper so that everything will function properly. Now coming a little further down, we'll have this 3-pin connector. This is where your horn harness will plug in. Just after that, we'll have our brake switch connector. Coming down a little bit further towards the middle of the harness, you'll have your positive and negative connections that run to our battery. And as we come closer towards the rear of the harness, you'll find this group of wires. This is so that you can install the LGT-102 LED bar light if you choose. And then our last connections to be made will be the two 3-pin connectors for our taillights. Now you'll notice the difference is on the basic harness, the headlight connectors were white and the taillights were red. Here, all of them are going to be white, but again, you'll notice the taillight connectors are going to be labeled driver and passenger side so that they are hooked up properly so that you don't have a left turn signal on and your right tail light flashing. Now please keep in mind that this installation video is going to be for the LGT-695 deluxe harness. And now that we've shown you all of the features of the LGT-695 harness, we're ready to begin our installation. Now before we begin routing our wiring harness, there's a few safety precautions that must be followed. First, you want to make sure that your key is in the off position, parking brake fully engaged. Be sure that if you have an electric cart that your tow run switch is in the tow position. And last but not least, be sure to disconnect your batteries. Once you have all of those safety precautions in order, you're ready to begin installing your deluxe wiring harness. Now, in order to make routing our wiring harness a little bit easier, we're first going to remove our seat bottom. Now, this isn't a necessary step, but it will definitely make things a lot simpler. Now, the first thing we're going to do is to identify the front portion of our wiring harness by locating the headlight and 9-pin connectors. We're going to route these down to the battery compartment and under the cart at this time. Now, at this time, the only wires that should be left in your battery compartment area are the positive and negative connections for your batteries, as well as your taillight connections. Now, it's also important to note that you don't want to pull too tight when routing your wires, as you could run the risk of damaging or breaking the wires, or possibly losing the labels attached that identify where your wiring harness should go to. Now, in the battery compartment area, you want to be sure you leave enough slack on your battery connections so that you can make those connections when the time comes. Once you feel like you have an adequate amount of slack on your battery connections, you want to begin routing your taillight connections towards the rear of the cart. Now, remember that the driver and passenger side are going to be labeled. However, in the event that you lose one of the labels, you will also be able to identify the passenger side, as it will be the longer of the two harnesses. Now, as you're routing your wiring harness towards the rear of the cart, you want to be sure that you zip tie it out of the way of any moving parts. Also, be sure to leave the zip ties a little bit loose in case you have to readjust the harness later on in the installation. Now, in order to route our taillight connectors towards the rear of the cart, we're going to follow the wire harness that's in the battery compartment area already. And then for the passenger side, we're going to remove the access panel on the back of the cart and route our wiring across there and over to the passenger side taillight cutout. Now, you want to be sure that while you're routing your wiring harness, that you safely secure your battery connections away from the batteries so that they don't make accidental contact during the installation process. Now we're ready to route our taillight connections towards the rear of the cart. Now, you're going to have a shorter harness that's going to be labeled driver side and a longer harness that's going to be labeled passenger side. We're going to route these to the respective openings in the body that we cut for the taillights. Now, keep in mind that we've already cut the holes for our taillights in a previous installation video, and if you need to see how to do this properly, please feel free to check out that video. Now, the first thing we're going to do is run our driver side connector over the wheel well and out of the driver side cutout for the taillight. Once you have your driver side connector in place, we're going to remove the access panel so we can route the passenger side connector over to the passenger side opening and also be able to secure it away from any moving parts. Once you have your taillight connectors routed to their proper location, we can then install our taillights and secure them in place using the provided mounting hardware. Once you have both taillights installed and you've secured all of your taillight wiring away from any moving parts, you can reinstall the access panel cover. Now, at this time, we're going to move on to routing the remaining portion of our harness towards the front of the cart. Now, as you're routing the harness up, you want to place the specific portions in the area where they'll be located. So, for example, if you're going to be installing a brake switch, you want to take the connector for the brake switch and keep it up in the area where your brake pedal is located. Any items that you won't be using, say for example, you're not going to be installing a horn, you just want to take that connector and zip tie it to the harness. That way it's not dragging down low and run the risk of getting it caught up in some moving parts or dragging on the ground later on. As we're running the harness underneath of the cart, you want to be sure to zip tie the harness away from any moving parts. Now, you also want to be sure to leave these zip ties loose in case you need to readjust the harness later on during the installation process. Now, also be sure to have some safety glasses for while you're under the cart to protect your eyes from any falling debris. Now once you have your harness routed towards the front, you want to begin identifying where each of your individual harnesses need to go in order to be plugged into the proper accessories. So for example, if you're going to be installing a brake switch, you want to make sure that the brake connector on your harness is located somewhere near the brake pedal where your brake switch is going to be installed. Now, for our case, we have a horn already installed from a previous video, and if you need any help or advice on installing the horn, please feel free to check out that video. However, we're going to go ahead and connect the horn switch from our harness to our horn at this time. Now, in order to connect the horn, you want to locate the 3-pin connector on our harness that's labeled horn switch, and then we're also going to take the 3-pin connector coming from our horn itself, and we're just going to simply plug those in together. And we're going to go ahead and leave that wire loose for the time being. We'll come back and zip tie it and secure it in place later on in the process. Now our next step is to route our headlight harnesses to their proper locations. Now while you're running these harnesses, you want to be mindful of any moving parts and be sure to avoid them so that your harnesses don't get caught up in those parts and get damaged later on while driving your cart. Now again, it's very important that you pay close attention to the labels that are on your harnesses so that you make sure that the driver's side goes to the driver's side and the passenger side goes to the passenger side. That way when you go to use your turn signal, if you turn on a left turn signal, you won't have your right turn signal flashing and vice versa. And once you have your harnesses routed to the proper location, you're then ready to install the headlights into your cart. Now again, we've previously done the installation of the headlights, so the holes are already cut out. If you need any assistance as far as lining up the templates and cutting the lights out, please feel free to check out that video. Now if you wish to use the high-low feature on your headlights, you're going to want to plug the bullet connector from your headlight into the bullet connector on the harness. If you don't wish to use that feature, you simply just don't connect them at all. Now you do also have the ability to use your lights as just a low power option. If you wish to do that, you just connect the 2 bullet connectors together from the headlight itself. If you wish to leave it as is, just leave them disconnected. Once you have all connections made, you can then secure your headlight to the cart using the provided mounting hardware. And once you've done this, you can then repeat the same process for your other headlight. Now once you have both headlights installed, you may notice that you'll have a little extra slack on your wires. This is okay. We're going to go ahead and leave them as is, and we'll come back and secure them in place after we have the rest of the harness installed. Now the next step is to remove the dash panel so that we can route our 9-pin connector as well as our push-pull switch connector into the dash cavity of the cart. Now in order to take our dash panel off, we must first remove the plastic column cover that we installed since we've already installed a turn signal. Now in order to do this, we just simply need to pry it away from the steering column. Now if you don't have a turn signal installed, you won't have the plastic column cover already in place. Now the next thing we're going to do is to remove the 2 plastic caps on each end of the dash panel, exposing 2 screws. After that, we're going to go ahead and remove those screws so that we can remove our dash panel. Once you have the dash panel removed, you can then route the harness that includes the 9-pin connector as well as the push-pull switch connector into the dash cavity area. Now if you're not going to be installing a turn signal, you're going to want to install the included 9-pin jumper harness onto the 9-pin connector. Now depending on whether or not you're installing a brake switch will depend on which connector you use on the 9-pin jumper harness. Now since we're actually going to be using a turn signal, we're going to go ahead and discard the 9-pin jumper harness and plug in the 9-pin connector from our turn signal to the 9-pin connector from our deluxe wiring harness. Now since we've opted to use the high-low beam on our headlights, we're going to go ahead and connect the bullet connectors from the turn signal to the bullet connector from the deluxe wire harness. Now you'll still have these 2 terminals here. These are for if you're installing a 12-volt outlet on the cart. Now since we're not going to be doing that, we're going to go ahead and secure these with the harness out of the way. Now you also have your 4-pin push-pull connector. Now if you're installing one of the 2 basic turn signals, they won't have the ability to operate your headlights. They will only operate turn signals. So you'll need to plug in the included push-pull switch to this connector. Now if you're going to be installing our deluxe turn signal that can operate the headlights as well as turn signals, you can either leave the push-pull switch installed and just tuck it away, or you can install the LGT-590 relay to the 4-pin push-pull connector. Once you have all your connections made, we're going to go ahead and secure all of our wires into the dash cavity area and then reinstall our dash panel. If you're going to be installing the push-pull switch, you're going to want to take the included template, place it on the dash panel, lining it up as indicated. You're then going to take a 3/8 inch drill bit and drill out the marked location on the template, and then you'll be able to secure your push-pull switch in place. Once you have your template lined up, you can either use some tape to hold it in place or use a center punch to mark your hole. Now, since we're not going to be installing the push-pull switch, we're not going to be demonstrating this process. Now, the next thing we're going to do is to make our connections at the battery. Now, you only want to do this after all of your accessories have been installed and properly connected. Now, if you're going to be installing the LED light kit, this can operate in a range of 12 to 24 volts, so you may not necessarily need a voltage reducer. Now, the main drawback with not using a voltage reducer is that you'll be putting extra strain on the batteries that you're connected to. This means those batteries will drain faster than the rest of the batteries on the cart. Now, if you're going to be doing a halogen light kit, these can only operate at a max of 12 volts, so if you have an electric cart that doesn't have 12-volt batteries, you're going to need to use a voltage reducer. If you're going to be installing any additional accessories such as a radio, these will typically only operate on a 12-volt maximum. So if you're installing it on an electric cart and you don't have 12-volt batteries, you will need to use a voltage reducer. So be sure to check the owner's manual of any accessories that you're installing to see what the maximum operating voltage is for those accessories. Now, when it comes to making the connections at the battery, since we're using an LED light kit and we have an electric cart with 8-volt batteries, we're going to use the 16-volt battery configuration to hook up our light kit. Now, since the batteries may not always be in the factory configuration, it's always a good practice to check for voltage before making any connections. Now, in order to do this, you simply want to take the negative lead from your multimeter, place it on the negative lead of the first battery, and then you can go along and check and see. We have 8 volts here. We'll have 16 volts here. So this is where we want to place our positive terminal from our light kit, is on the 16-volt connection. Now that we've properly identified which battery configuration will give us 16 volts, we're going to take the negative lead from our light kit and place it on the first battery's negative terminal. Next, we're going to take the positive lead from our harness and connect it to the positive terminal of the battery that gives us 16 volts. And now that we have our light kit harness connected to our batteries, the next thing we're going to do is to connect the positive terminal from the last battery in line. Now that all connections have been made and the batteries have been reconnected, we now want to go through and test the functionality of all of our accessories that have been installed. After you've tested the functionality of all of your accessories, we want to go back through and secure any loose wires away from any moving parts. Once you've verified that everything is working properly, you want to go back through and secure any loose wires under the front of the cart away from any moving parts, the rear of the cart, as well as in your battery compartment. Again, you want to be sure that everything is free and clear from any moving parts and nothing is hanging low or dragging on the ground. Now, the last thing you want to do is to double check that all of our wiring has been secured away from any moving parts. Once you've verified this, that'll complete the installation of our deluxe wiring harness, part number LGT-695, on this 2011 Club Car DS. Now, be sure to also check out our other installation videos for the voltage reducer, turn signal, brake switches, and other accessories tied into this light kit. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.